Here, should be. Okay, good afternoon. We had hoped to wait for some more persons, but it doesn't look like we're getting any more right now. So I'm going to invite Trevor to continue the third part of his four-part presentation.
Thank you very much, Joe. And allow me first to welcome all who shall be joining and who shall visit us on YouTube later on to the third of four presentations. And the four presentations are on the theme, Strengthening Civil Society in Jamaica to Impact Our Democracy. And this project was proposed by NIA some 2 years ago, supported by the European Union, and we thank them for that. And we're very happy that St. Michael's invited me to do this as a short course, which they would offer here at the college. The last presentation, those of you who were here might recall, and who might have visited the presentation on YouTube, dealt with the global situation. And it identified what has been appropriate to describe as a global democratic recession. Democratic recession, which has meant that there are now more autocratic or authoritarian governments and countries than there are democratic for the first time in many, many years. And also, very, very disturbingly, that even in democracies with elections, there is a tendency towards the erosion of the structures of democracy, a tendency toward authoritarianism, or what is called autocratizing. And that is a global phenomenon. And we are looking at that in the context of where the Caribbean is. And my overall conclusion in relation to Jamaica, which we shall develop this afternoon and also in the fourth and final lecture next week, is that Jamaica is in a significant period of democratic backsliding, erosion of our structures, but we are not. And I don't want to add as yet, we are not in a democratic recession. And what we shall be doing in the next presentation is to really talk a bit, more than a bit, about how do we summon ourselves, parliamentarians, civil society leaders, community organizations, citizens associations, professional groups. How do we summon ourselves to prevent backsliding from developing into a full-fledged recession? So I wanted to remind you of the extent to which Jamaica has built a democratic foundation and the structures of democracy, because we easily forget, and if we don't recall the extent to which successive leaders from both sides of the aisle, civil society bodies came together and ensured that we do have and have built a significant democratic structure, we will not be able to identify the extent of the backsliding which we want to discuss this afternoon. So we built in that period between primarily 1990 and 2011, but continuing into 2017, a whole set of legislation, about a dozen laws, set up institutions, codes of conduct, and procedures that would make sure that Jamaican people's rights would be reinforced and that Jamaican democracy would place significant guardrails, significant constraints on what we set up at independence in 1962. And what we established then and was recognized by some of those making the Constitution in their comments in the committee, we really did set up an office of the Prime Minister with dictatorial powers. And that is on the record. Our founding fathers, unfortunately no ladies on that committee, as far as I can recall, acknowledged that we had set up an executive with dictatorial powers. That set of powers was seriously, continuously circumscribed, particularly in those 30 years, 1990 to 2011, 2020, so much so, it culminated in the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, a most significant and important step in ensuring that the rights of Jamaican people, the man in the street, up top to bottom and in the middle, were guaranteed in a way that would be significant. So I want to quickly review. We set up measures in that period in building our democratic structure from which we do not wish to slide back ways. We set up measures to take politicians out of the authority to pad voters' lists and to draw constituency boundaries, powers which they had for many decades before 2006 with the establishment of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. In strengthening our democracy, we established and empowered officers independent of politics, independent of government control, to allow ordinary citizens, anybody, to hold to account ministers, ministries, departments, and agencies, public bodies of whatever kind. And the milestones in the development of that journey and the infrastructure that strengthened that architecture was, of course, the Office of the Public Defender. Very important office. In fact, without that office, we would not have had the court being able to do what it did a few days ago. Our courts ruled that the Prime Minister exceeded his powers in granting the license and overruling NEPA to Bengali and to develop the dry harbor mining. It was brought by citizens. The public defender took that responsibility and went to court and got that ruling, which has been quite a landmark. Then we set up, of course, the Public Bodies Management Accountability Act. And what that law did is to say that 164 public bodies, the National Works Agency, Water Commission, all of them, spending our money, they have to report to us through the Parliament and through the relevant minister each year, within 3 months of the end of the parliamentary year, to tell us what they have done with the money, what plans did they implement, and what plans do they propose. So that was another important development. And along with that, which was done in 2001, was the Executive Agencies Act, which of course that bound in a similar fashion particular agencies that were set up to be more speedy and efficient in their functioning, but which would all at the same time be held to account. And as we speak, as before the Parliament, is the current legislation, which is to be under the Executive Agencies Act, the National Reconstruction and Resilience Agency. Then, in addition to the PBMAA and the Executive Agencies Act, of course, we set up INDECOM. And INDECOM, the independent investigation, was set up in 2010, the Independent Investigation Commission, to ensure that the security forces, the police, military would be held to account to obey the law. So then there we were, accountability measures set up. Then as well, in that period, we, government, opposition, civil society, professional associations, community organizations, all came together to say there must be a limit on how far government can keep secrets from us. We must have a right to be informed, to be told what is going on, subject to certain limits. And that was done in the Access to Information Act, which was passed in 2002. Along the same lines of giving us a right to know what is going on, particularly how our money is being spent, the Office of the Contractor General, succeeded by the Integrity Commission in 2017, the Office of the Contractor General from 1986 was publishing every year, in fact, every quarter, the contracts awarded to public bodies over a certain amount by public bodies by ministries, departments, and agencies. We needed to know, and we did know, which private entity, what company, who was getting big money from us, the taxpayer, to carry out projects, what were the terms and conditions, what were they supposed to be doing. So again, we built an institution and legislation to tell us what was going on. Then, of course, we also developed procedures and mechanisms and practices, even more so than procedures, for consultation to involve the public, to involve us, civil society bodies, private sector groups, professional associations, to get us involved in the process of lawmaking and of keeping our democracy alive. So that in 2005, a code of public consultation for public sector bodies was passed, which indicated and required that public bodies, before taking any significant decision, would need to consult stakeholders. And we need to be informed as to what was the plan so that we could develop our own views and put them forward. That was that code of public consultation. But between 2007 and 2009, we implemented a massive program of public consultations, including advertisements, radio jingles, through all media, in developing and discussing our National Development Plan, Vision 2030. It wasn't done by a few people. It was done by all of us in consultation over a period of time, with the public knowing what was being proposed and being able to impact the final decisions. Then, similarly, we set up in 2011 the Public Disclosures Act. In other words, what that law does is protect you and I, not perfectly, not as well as it ought, but it started the process. If we saw wrong, to report it and to get action to reverse the wrongs that we may be witnessing. The Public Protected Disclosures Act, or the whistleblower legislation. And perhaps most significantly, between 1991 and 2011, 1991, the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Commission. In 2011, with the passage of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms and its incorporation into our Constitution, during that period, massive consultations at all levels with the public. In fact, the Constitutional Commission set up to look at how our Constitution should be reformed and coming forward with a number of proposals and measures to limit the power of the Prime Minister and to give greater power to our citizenry. That body had 39 members on it. Every significant sector of our society was represented. Organizations of women, organizations of youth, academics, professional bodies, farmers, trade unions, private sector, and of course, both parliamentary political parties. And that is what led ultimately to the establishment of joint select committees of parliament, which sat, deliberated, received submissions from the public, and then produced this path-breaking establishment strengthening of our rights and freedoms, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. It is important for us when we have an opportunity to familiarize ourselves with the rights that are protected there. One of them in the news recently, the right to a healthy and productive environment. We never had that before 2011. It came about because of consultation and because of a consensus that we needed to protect the environment, even as we acknowledge its importance for development. And what that law does, in as many words, it says, no prime minister, no government, no police, no authority, no power, no organ of the state in Jamaica, no body whatsoever can infringe the rights that are protected, can abridge those rights, or can abrogate, that is, get rid of those rights, without it being justifiable in a free and democratic society. And that justifiability, that justification, is not going to be determined by Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, civil society, or anybody else. It's determined by our courts. And that fundamental protection that all of us enjoy. And when you marry that to the office of the public defender, then you will see that we established a robust structure available to us to be able to defend our rights and to uphold them. Then I want to mention, finally, in this era of citizens' consultation and the right of us to be heard, the right to petition. The right to petition the government was established in 2017. Petition the office of the Prime Minister. And it said quite clearly that if you had an issue you wanted to raise and you wanted to hear what the government has to say about it, that if you collected a certain number of signatures, too high in my view, the number, somewhere in the region, I think, the last number, that is 15,000 signatures would have to be collected within a space of 40 days. Once that is done, the office of the Prime Minister must respond. That is what we set up in 2017. How far it's actually functioning now is something that we shall be looking at. And that was actually used. It was used by the environmental bodies, particularly Jamaica Environmental Trust, who actually gathered 34,000 signatures in respect of defining the boundaries and defending the cockpit country from intrusion beyond a certain level by mining entities and the communities being thereby disrupted. So the point we're making is that on the election foundation, democratic structures were built, many of them pioneering. And they need to be examined now to see how far they have been kept, strengthened, or now being undermined. One last area I should mention before going on, and that is in the area of crime. We decided during those years that in addition to the gangsterism and the gangs in the streets, that high value, white collar crime needed to be targeted and corruption needed to be targeted. And that was an agreement among both sides. It was an agreement seriously influenced by civil society representations, particularly in the case of corruption by National Integrity Action over many years. And what this led to, targeting of high value, white collar crime and corruption, was the establishment of the Financial Investigations Division in 2002. And subsequently, and perhaps most fundamentally, the major organized crime anti-corruption agency that was set up in 2014 and became independent fully in 2021. Along the same lines, we led the Caribbean and much of the hemisphere in the establishment of campaign finance regulations in 2017, which required disclosure, limited, too far limited, but nevertheless, it opened the door to disclosure of big money donations to political parties. And what that law did is outlaw anonymous contributions and contributions from illegal sources. So we're talking about quite a substantial structure, an architecture of democracy on the foundation of our electoral system. At the same time, however, as these very positive developments were being implemented, our democratic system, Parliament and the decision makers, were making policy choices and contributing to policy outcomes and failures, which ultimately undermined the standard of living, widened inequality in Jamaica, and were harmful to the majority of our citizens. In fact, it was in 2014 that Jamaica's national security policy estimated that fully 5% of our gross domestic product, roughly $100 billion each year, was lost to education, to health, to other important services for the people, was lost to corruption each year. In fact, in 2014, the national security policy stated that the number one clear and present danger to Jamaica's development was the corruption of elected and public officials, public works contracts awarded to criminals. And that conclusion is so important, I want to quote it at length, because as you shall see, 2014 is not behind us. That national security policy stated in part, quotes, "The focus has to shift from street-level criminals to the top bosses who enjoy and control the profits, and to the people who own and handle the money. That is, the facilitators, the politicians, lawyers, accountants, doctors, businessmen, real estate brokers who operate in both the licit and illicit worlds." The national security policy continued, and here I quote, "They channel contracts to businesses that are fronts for organized crime, create chains of subcontracts that conceal the true beneficiaries, public works projects, establish offshore corporations." These are the true beneficiaries. Public works projects establish offshore corporations to move funds out of the jurisdiction or the reach of law enforcement. So national security policy in 2014. It goes on to say, it launders money into real estate assets and buildings and allow or facilitate a range of other corrupt and financial business transactions. And I want us to listen to this. Targeting the top bosses and their facilitators is therefore the most effective way to degrade criminal networks, seize their assets, and undermine their power. And that is on page 2930 of our National Security Policy of 2014, reflecting one of the main ways in which policy failures impacted negatively the extent of public services, the funding for health and education, and for the environment available to our people. The policy outcomes to which I refer, of course, have the impact of weakening support for our democracy. Tens of thousands of Jamaicans migrated, those with skills, with leadership capacity, because of their dissatisfaction with the policy outcomes that impacted negatively. In fact, the main contributors to this was the 1990s, the banking crisis, and successive International Monetary Fund agreements with Jamaica. And let's not forget the global financial crisis, which led all of this to cuts in government expenditure. Looking at the total outcome, it meant during those years, successive public sector wage freezes between 2010 and 2013, for example. In fact, the wage freeze amounted, please excuse me, to an inflation, to a pay cut when inflation is taken into account. It led to a surge in unemployment. 10% in 2008 became 16% in 2013, the second highest at the time in the Americas. It increased the number of Jamaicans living in poverty from 10% in 2007 to 17% in 2010. And most of all, the International Monetary Fund report of 2011 said, in relation to Jamaica, the gap between rich and poor is wider. And it went on to say that at the time, Jamaica had the second worst level of inequality in income distribution among the 23 countries in the Americas. And the Gini coefficient, which is what they used to measure, was 59.9%. It was worse than every other country except Haiti, and only outranked by Suriname. So overall, between 1990 and 2020, the overall impact of our democracy on our people was on Jamaica's human development. And the human development is measured, as you know, by the United Nations Development Program. They have what they call a Human Development Index. And what that does, brings together indicators related to education, indicators relating to health, indicators relating to income, and it combines these in an index. And what our index between 1990 and 2020 showed that Jamaica lagged globally. And not only globally, we lagged relative to our Caribbean brothers and sisters. In fact, we dropped from number 63 in rank in 1990 to 114 in 2020. That means we dropped behind all other Caribbean countries. Trinidad was 67, Grenada was 74, with the exception of Haiti. So we can see the very complex situation that we faced. Pressure from all of us to strengthen our democratic structures. But at the same time, policy failures, policy choices, and outcomes meant that our standard of living was being buffeted, and the gap between the few and the many what Prime Minister as he became. And at that time, Senator Edward Seaga called the gap between the haves and the have-nots was being widened in Jamaica. So we now look against that background of what have we been doing to strengthen our democratic structures, to engage them so that they perform better in our interest? Or have we been seeing backsliding, an erosion of what we won, an undermining of transparency and accountability, an undermining of our capacity to impact and our knowledge of what is going on? Let me say immediately, in respect of what we described correctly as the foundation of any democracy, namely the structures allowing for and underpinning free and fair elections. In respect of the structures, the Electoral Commission of Jamaica law, in that law, passed in 2006, there is a commitment, hence the term interim. There's a commitment that this law would be placed in the Constitution and given constitutional protection. What does that mean in simple language? Once that was done, it would mean that no prime minister, no government by using its majority could either weaken the Electoral Commission or even abolish the commission. That was the commitment arising from all of us coming together to make that path-breaking legislation. Now, it's 20 years after, we're in 2026. That commitment was made in 2006. And that Electoral Commission, our Electoral Commission, as we speak, remains vulnerable. Vulnerable to any amendment that any majority government would like to put to change the law, to weaken the protections for electoral foundation. And this is one significant area that the backsliding on that commitment presents a grave danger, which has to be corrected. Indeed, the law was in effect amended in February 2024 by a parliamentary majority to incorporate into the structure the office of the political ombudsman. So you can see that already that law can be changed by a parliamentary majority because it does not have the protections that would allow or require a 2/3 majority in the House and in the Senate in order to have it changed. So this is one area, one commitment that we need to notice and we need to deal with. Regarding accountability, have we seen strengthening here? Have we seen standing still? Have we seen any backsliding? First, we notice that the office of the political ombudsman remained interim after 26 years, can be abolished by a parliamentary majority. No protection as required in the law. Perhaps I should mention that this applies even more to the office of the protector, the citizen, the person who protects the rights involved in electioneering to ensure that electioneering keeps within certain bounds and that the public resources are not used in a partisan way after elections, because that office has been subsumed, no longer independent, into the law to which we just referred, the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. Contemplate for a moment the office of the public defender. Suppose a government became upset that the public defender is using that authority given to the office to take too many complaints from citizens to the courts, and that the public defender is getting rulings from the courts similar to the one handed down in relation to Dry Harbor, which points to the fact that ministerial discretion and authority ought not to be used to overrule a regulatory body unless there is clear and persuasive evidence on which to base the overrule. The government became upset. They could simply abolish the office of the public defender because it has no protection from a parliamentary majority. And that was what was envisaged in the law when it was passed, because it's an interim act until such time as it was given constitutional protection. Similarly, legislation that we have passed to ensure accountability, the Public Bodies Management Accountability Act, the Executive Agencies Act, what have we seen? Chronic breaches of the law to hold the public bodies to account without the law requiring compliance being enforced. I think it's important to note this at this particular point. I'll give you an example. There are approximately 48 public bodies and executive agencies within the Ministry of Economic Development and Infrastructure, Ministry of Economic Development and Infrastructure. Amongst those public bodies are executive agencies, such as is being proposed, far less controls, far more power, far more control over public resources. The present law being passed and will be debated in the Senate on Friday, National Reconstruction Resilience Act. But as we speak, the Ministry of Economic Growth and Infrastructure Development has agencies under it which are in breach of the law, and nothing is happening. The National Environmental Planning Agency, the last time they told the minister and the parliament, and through the minister and the parliament, you and I, the people, the taxpayers, the last time we were told what that ministry had done, the last time we were informed regarding the annual report. And remember, the annual report is supposed to be presented each year within 3 months of the end of the fiscal year to the minister concerned. And in this case, the minister is the prime minister, who is the Minister of Economic Growth and Infrastructure and Development. The last NEPA report listed on the Cabinet Secretary's website is 10 years ago, relating to 2015, 2016. Just consider that. Money is being spent. Annual report required, none for 2016, 2017, none for 2017, 2018, none for 2018, 2019. And you can note, when was the 2015, 2016 report presented? That should have been done within 3 months of the end of that fiscal year. It was presented in 2024. It was submitted in 2024. The National Lands Agency, the last year to which they submitted an annual report was 2010, 2011. The Urban Development Corporation, again, using the Cabinet Secretary's website, the last year to which their annual report, applied was 2017, 2018. And so it goes on. The Forestry Department, again, an agency under the Ministry of Economic Growth and Infrastructure Development, Prime Minister's Ministry. The last time their report referred to fiscal year 2017, 2018. All of these delinquent, none of them brought up in accordance with the requirements and the possibilities of the law, which allows the Attorney General to summon them to comply or be taken before the courts and be fined. In fact, I should mention that the last time that that was done by an Attorney General was in 2014, when 15 entities were threatened, is the word I would use, was indicated that if they did not present their reports, they would be brought before the courts and subject to fines. Of the 15 agencies, 14 complied almost immediately. So here is a clear case of backsliding in the enforcement of law on high-level officials at the very same time that the small man is being subjected appropriately and correctly to laws which apply to his breaches. Where are we in relation to equality before the law, one of the fundamental principles of our democracy? And so we're seeing that the measures, the procedures, the law to ensure accountability, our ability to hold to account those who are spending our money, not being enforced, despite our complaints to the authorities that this should be done. And you know, NIA has raised this matter repeatedly. JAMP has raised it regularly, and others as well. We come to another matter. Again, backsliding on accountability. In 2020, an important mechanism to hold government to account and to hold public bodies to account and to ensure that policy was being implemented in the way approved was abandoned. What was that? That was the practice, not put into the standing orders of Parliament, but nevertheless, the practice initiated by the administration of Prime Minister Bruce Golding in 2007. And what that practice developed and maintained 2007, 2008, right up to 2020, was that the sessional committees of Parliament looking at infrastructure, for example, that these would be chaired by members of the opposition. And members of the opposition would have a vested interest in doing what oppositions are there to do, which is to protect the public interest and to disclose when there are irregularities. So that practice was abandoned. The opposition now only chairs the Public Accounts Committee and the Public Administration Appropriations Committee, 2. I believe there are many others, 6 or 7 others, which are now chaired by government members instead of the opposition. This is an important erosion of a significant accountability mechanism. And so that is a measure that we have to look at and to see how it is that we are going to deal with that. Further aspect of democratic backsliding, very, very dangerous. And that is the proposal supported by a majority of government members of the Joint Select Committee reviewing the Integrity Commission Act, which, as you know, was passed in 2017 under the first administration of Prime Minister Holness, and which brought together the Office of the Contractor General, as well as 2 other bodies, to ensure stronger enforcement of integrity. That Joint Select Committee is now proposing, majority government members have supported, that the Auditor General and that the Office of the Auditor General, whoever is the Auditor General, whoever is in that office, should be removed from membership on the Integrity Commission. You should know that that is a 50-year practice, even before the establishment of the current Integrity Commission, the Parliament Integrity of Members Act of 1973, put the Auditor General as part of the commission to enforce the requirements under that law. So from 1973, under Prime Ministers Manley, Seago, Patterson, Portia Simpson-Miller, Bruce Golding, and indeed, under Prime Minister Holness in the first administration of 2016 to 2020. And continuing now, the Auditor General has maintained the position as a member of the oversight body looking at the parliamentary behavior, particularly the income, assets, liabilities of parliamentarians, and to ensure that the statutory declarations are submitted appropriately and on time to that body. This is not something that we should allow to pass. We continue to look at the instances and the events which indicate this process of backsliding. It was in February of 2016 the then opposition leader and now Prime Minister Holness committed publicly to start the legislative process for development of an impeachment act. That is an act that would hold to account parliamentarians guilty of misconduct. And he said that he would start the legislative process for an impeachment act to ensure that only members of quote unquote unquestioned integrity serve in the parliament, and that he would be doing that within the first 100 days of holding office. In 2016, he took over in March of 2016. You and I can count the number of days beyond 100, and this has not been done. What makes it worse is that in 2021, the leader of the opposition proposed a similar act, legislation, taken up from where Bruce Golding would also propose that when he was Prime Minister. And that proposal for impeachment made by the leader of the opposition in 2021 got no support at the time, despite the fact that beyond Holness's commitment, beyond the draft legislation developed by Prime Minister Golding, beyond the draft developed by opposition leader Mark Golding, the National Development Plan Vision 2030 includes a commitment to legislate impeachment, to hold parliamentarians to account. Nothing done, not acceptable. We move beyond accountability in this concerning story of slippage, of reneging on commitments, and bringing the system into disrepute. Promises made, promises not kept. Commitments made, commitments unfulfilled. Come to the issue of transparency. The mechanisms and regulations to allow us, the public, to know what is going on. And I want to spend a few moments on this. In 2011, 15 years ago, when a joint select committee of Parliament reviewed the Access to Information Act, it came up with a particular decision. And the decision to ensure transparency and accountability was that the Official Secrets Act, passed by the colonial administration during the colonial period, a law which the colonial power abandoned in its own jurisdiction many years ago. Our 2011 Joint Select Committee recommended that the Official Secrets Act should be repealed. Why? Because that law is and was being used as a tool of intimidating, particularly public servants, from seeing, speaking, and reporting wrongdoing which they may observe. What they would be told, and the records are there, is that if you talk, if you speak out, you're in breach of the Official Secrets Act. And therefore it was recommended, both sides agreed, that this law should be repealed. In 2026, this law remains and is being used to undermine the impact of the whistleblower legislation, which would otherwise provide a limited, too limited degree of protection. Then another effort to erode and move backwards from Jamaica's democracy. 2019, the government proposed to extend the period of secrecy, the period for which you and I don't know, can't access cabinet papers. It's our papers, they're taking decisions on our behalf. correctly, there's a period of time that should elapse before those papers are disclosed, and that happens in all democracies. But it was proposed in 2019 that the time it should remain secret should be extended from 20 years to how many? 70. We wouldn't know what going on until 70 years after. A clear proposal to go backwards on our democratic structure and our democratic procedures. 2020, the year after, a practice allowing for transparency, implemented initially by the Office of the Contractor General, 1986, of publishing on a quarterly basis contracts awarded by public bodies, agencies, and ministries, so that you and I would know who is being awarded contracts to do what with our money. That ceased in 2020. Clear backsliding. Most troubling of all, I have to say, and I'm not imputing motive, I'm simply looking at the overall impact. And that is the extent to which prime ministers have sought to take actions that invade, breach, undermine the constitutional rights and the freedoms of our people. This has been a very rare occurrence until fairly recently, because each prime minister swears to uphold and defend the constitution and laws of Jamaica. Prime ministers have sometimes taken actions or refused to take action which threaten to breach or are questionable under the Constitution. For example, it was in 2005, if my records and memory serve me correct, Prime Minister P.J. Patterson legislated to establish the Caribbean Court of Justice as a final court, but without the appropriate procedures and without making it appropriately entrenched. That was overruled and declared unconstitutional by the Privy Council. But a very rare occurrence. In 2020-21, again, hopefully my memory and records serve me right, the Privy Council ruled, 2021, that the members of the People's National Party who were refusing to testify in open court concerning the Trafigura matter, that is the donations from Trafigura Behera oil moving firm to the PNP at a time when it had a contract with the government, the Privy Council ruled that they had to testify in open court. So there have been occasions in the past. But within recent times, there have been too many occasions when our Prime Minister has sought to take action which infringes, breaches constitutional provisions. First of these was in 2015. As leader of the opposition, as he was then, Andrew Holness required his Senate appointees to submit to him as the appointing officer under our Constitution pre-signed letters of resignation, so that at the time you're appointed, you hand to the leader of the opposition a letter of resignation signed by you, but undated. This caused a significant court action because it accompanied the removal of then Senator Arthur Williams and Christopher Tufton. And the court had to rule that such an action was in breach of the Constitution. Then in 2018, despite the objection, despite resistance, the government passed the National Identification System Act, NIDS, and our court had to rule that this act, as it was in that form, violated the rights of the Jamaican people, and therefore had to be withdrawn and amended in order to be acceptable. Then in 2025, perhaps most significantly, the Constitutional Court ruled that states of emergency declared on 15 different dates between 2018 and 2023 were done in a manner that violated provisions of the Constitution. And therefore, these were ruled unconstitutional. And we come to 2026 with the case on which the court recently ruled, the Bengali Development Company and the Dry Harbor Mining, where the court ruled that the permit granted by the Prime Minister was null and void and cannot stand, because what it did was purport to give the minister the power to override a regulatory agency, a power which should only be exercised on the basis of clear evidence-based justification. In the language of the court, clear evidence-based justification. And this was not the case, hence it was overruled. I heard in today's newscast that the government is appealing that ruling, as it has the right to do. But it must be a matter in the context of a global recession of democracy, in the context of backsliding among democracies which have not yet entered into recession, that in Jamaica's instance, there are so many examples where the robust democratic structures we have erected on electoral foundations are in peril. Our responsibility and this will be the purpose of our fourth and final lecture, is to discuss fully how do we, as civil society organizations, as the man in the street, as members of parliament, whichever side, how do we, as service clubs, professional associations, how do we respond? How are we to resist this backsliding, which is apparently on us, even as we speak? In that regard, I want to say that on the next occasion, we'll include in that conversation a fulsome assessment of the extent to which the NRAA, Resilience and Reconstruction Act, now before the Parliament, fits into this picture of backsliding, and what can we do? How do we do it in order to ensure that the evidence of backward movement does not move Jamaica into a democratic recession? That will be the purpose of our next session, and we look forward to that conversation on that occasion. And thank you very much for the opportunity this afternoon.
Thanks, Trevor. And thank you all for joining us on this third session. We look forward to the fourth. It's interesting that Trevor has outlined how in the last few years, so many of the achievements of previous years seem to be under threat and being eroded. So we look forward to the next session, because the question is, where do we go? Thanks. Welcome.
Go ahead. Anton?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Trevor. And again, I want to join with Joe in thanking you for once again an excellent presentation. There's so many things that I would want to say in response, whether based on what you've shared with us this evening. As a member of the executive of CAFE, I want to point out that in respect of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, we as an organization did make a submission to the Constitutional Reform Committee in 2024 on the very point of having it entrenched in the Constitution. And of the three submissions that we made, that was the only one that was accepted by that commission. But of course, that commission has failed now, since its work has gone up in smoke, literally, as far as I'm concerned, and that's a process that'll have to start again. But I thought I'd point that out. But in concert with that, the other two proposals which we made, one of which I think is significant to the conversation we are having today, which had to do with the Electoral Commission being given the power to set the dates for parliamentary and local government by-elections whenever vacancies came due within a certain window of time after those vacancies came due. That was not accepted. And we've had to write quite recently about, I think there are 4 parish council seats that are vacant right now and have been vacant since September last year. 3 as a result of the persons being elected to Parliament, and 1 because of the death of a candidate. But the fact is that of a councillor, sorry. But the fact is that the situation remains the same, and I think that's an important derogation of the democratic rights of our people, that a prime minister or a government can't simply leave a parliamentary seat or a local government seat totally and completely unrepresented till it suits that person to have the election. The third proposal we made had to do with fixed election dates, but I won't say anything about that now. Also, of course, we had objected to the Office of the Political Ombudsman being subsumed into the Electoral Commission of Jamaica for obvious reasons, and that our objections were frankly ignored. So that's the situation that continues. But in that context, I could say more about many other things here, other things that you've raised in that context. What we are seeing where we are, and you're seeing it quite, everybody sees it. There is a general apathy towards the electoral process, towards democracy, towards elections. And that is, I think, in part a consequence of many of the things that you have outlined here. Our turnout at the last election was just under 40%, a little up on the one before, but the one before was held in the middle of COVID. And I would have thought that now that we're out of this, we would have seen a surge back into the 40s. No, we didn't have that. It was down at 39% or thereabouts. So this is a very worrisome trend because people are turned off of the electoral process. And when large numbers of people are turned off from the electoral process, they will eventually find other ways to express themselves or to allow their feelings to be known. And that is not what we really want. We fought hard, as we pointed out, for this process to be established, where we each have a say, and we don't really want to end that in this way.
Very important observation, Anton, and thank you for that, because this is one of the areas that I literally am wrapping my mind around almost every day as to how do we, in the context that you indicate, how do we mount successful resistance to the erosion of rights and freedoms that we're seeing? And that's what I want to speak of entirely next time, looking at successful examples of where we have resisted in the past and looking at what's happening in other countries experiencing similar processes of apathy, which is another way of expressing a more accurate term in my view is frustration, that folks feel that there's just little that they can do. They've tried one or two things, it's not working. Let me look out for myself. Next thing I'll put my head out and get victimized and so on and so forth. So I think a major part of what we have to talk about next time is, given the context, what and how, not just what is to be done, but how is it to be done in the framework of the current moment, looking at also the countries where long periods of frustration, long periods of apparent apathy have been followed by significant outbursts led by the youth, so-called Gen Z, the late teens and mid-20s in so many countries across the world. And in other areas where you have significant mass resistance, but it doesn't seem to be having an impact as quickly as people would wish. And I think of the United States, where there's really huge mobilizations going on, which you don't see in the mainstream press as much as you ought to. But still, it does not seem to be having the kind of impact to redress the erosion, which we discussed at some length last time, which international civil society bodies and academic institutions have observed in relation to the United States. And it's 250th anniversary of independence, quite coincidentally. Well, thank you for that. We're going to have to explore it very fully on our next lecture, the next presentation.
Thank you, Trevor. I just wanted to make two other quick points. One had to do with the reference you made to white-collar crime and corruption. We have had a situation where a minister and senior people have been charged with misdemeanor or whatever big charge of embezzle, whatever the charges are, and that has been dragged through one court and another for how many years now? 6, 7, 8 years? I I've lost count.
2018, 2026 and going on.
Yes, I see. You see that just more recently, I think early this year, three senior executives of a financial company were also arrested, and we are looking forward to a similar delay in the process of justice. Now, I appreciate that, but you know that other people with different circumstances in Jamaica, their cases are dealt with very rapidly. Okay, in some cases they don't even get to court, as you know. And that's another matter what we'll talk about somewhere else. But but you know, I'm just saying that that is an issue that bothers me because obviously going forward we would want to see those matters handled in a way without denigrating the justice to which they are entitled, to be handled in a way that people feel that there is going to be some justice going to come out of it. There's going to be something out of it. Either they're going to be exonerated and it's clear that an error was made in charging them, or they don't have the evidence, or they're going to be punished for what has happened. If not, then
Absolutely.
it's, the other thing I wanted to make just a brief reference to, of course, was the Official Secrets Act. I went to work with a government company on, I think it was the 2nd of January 1979. That dates me, but there you go. And I know the lady, she's still my friend. She walked into the little desk where I had to, before I could even put my bag down, with the Official Secrets Act in hand for me to sign,
Absolutely. That is amazing. And that's a good illustration.
Yes, I mean to say nothing happened. I couldn't even open the drapes on the window or et cetera, et cetera. She was there introducing herself, and there she was. You need to sign this, the Official Secrets Act. And I did. Um, Frankly, I've ignored it, but I didn't really have many secrets to handle. But you see this, the fact of this, it struck me when you spoke about it and the fact that this law has been repealed in other jurisdictions, in the jurisdiction we borrowed it from, but we seem to be holding on to it. And I can't see for the life of me why, because it as you say, it interferes with the Whistleblower Act to some extent. I could go on and on and on with my own personal experiences and reflections, but I won't. I am not professor. Thank
But it's
you.
important. These are the experiences that we need to hear. And that one is particularly graphic. Thank you, Anton.
I think that's it.
That's it. Well, thanks for the opportunity. And next time we have a lot to talk about.
I hope to be there in person next time.
Very good. Look forward to seeing you.
Okay.